Have you ever wanted to get data from an API? Like maybe you're building a Pokedex and you want to grab info from that PokeyAPI.co website? Well, if so, and you need some help, this is the video for you. So make sure to stick around and we'll do just that. So what we're going to do is make an API call using URL session. We are going to use a struct that conforms to Codeable to get that data from PokeyAPI.co, and we're going to present that data in a SwiftUI view. All I've done so far is create a new Xcode project, a new app, and it's using SwiftUI. So let's just take a look at it real quick. So you know what it looks like. So we're going to be using the result type that Swift 5 introduced, and the gist of results is that it's an enum, and there are two cases to it. One is a success and the other is a failure. And the success case has the value of the result. So if you're getting data, it's going to hold that data. And the failure implements the error protocol, and it's always given after a result of an asynchronous function, aka async function. So that means we'll have to use a closure to actually make this happen. This will allow us to handle that API call that is either successful or failure, because generally if you make an API call, you're either going to be successful, yay, or you're going to have a failure. Not yay, but we can do something based on that failure then. So like I said, we're going to use the URL session, but by default, the URL session doesn't actually have a way to handle this result type. So we're gonna have to build an extension first to handle that result type. So the first thing we need to do is make a new file and make that extension happen. So we're gonna right click in this folder here, hit new file. And since it's gonna be all based off the URL extension, the URL session, we're just gonna call it URL session plus extension. And now we can make that extension here just right off that URL session. Now what we're gonna do is we're gonna make a function part of this URL extension here, and it's gonna be func data task with URL result at escaping. And now, so that result is gonna be a completion handler is what we're doing here. So we have result, URL, data. Make sure to close, if you don't close the chevrons, it's going to cause a whole slew of issues now. And then void. And what we want to return completely is URL session data task. And then we are going to basically return this data task with the URL, but we're going to have it use that result failure and that result success here. So we're going to hit return or type return. See, and as you start typing, you'll start noticing that there's actually already like URLs in here that we can use, which is pretty nifty. The only thing is, and here's the issue, is that they don't actually use that result type. And that's kind of why we have to build all of this with URL. And what we're gonna do is actually put this into a tuple, basically. Data, response, error. And then we say if let error equal error. So basically, if there's an error, then what are we going to do? Well, we have to use the result and then specify what the error is. So now we're going to actually add in a return statement. That way we can break out, if it actually fails. Now, what do we do if it's successful? Well, that's when we handle the response. And actually, there might be a response that actually causes a failure. So that's another thing we're going to do. Guard let response equals response. Also, we want to check for the data. Else let error equals ns error. So basically here now we're declaring that there's if this fails, if the response and the data fail and they don't exist, then we have to get that error. We're going to specify that it's an error, 0, no, there's no user info. And again, we have to say that there's an error with the error, with that NS error that we just made, and then we return. Now the last thing, and the reason why it's getting mad is because we haven't used the data or the response. So that's what we're going to do right now. Result, it was successful. Response data. That is too many parentheses there. So that's what we had to do for that URL session, for that extension. And so that completion closure now uses the result type, which is great since it'll make the claw super clean, super clear for us to realize what's happening. And now we get to actually talk about that Pokey API service. So like I said, we are going to be using the PokeyAPI.co, the Pokey API, to get information about the Pokemon API. Here's the website. Here's what it looks like. It is super great, super useful, has tons of Pokemon information. Apparently they're updating for Sword and Shield, all that good stuff. But what we're going to actually be doing here is breaking apart and figuring out some parts of the URL first before we write any more Swift. It's important to know the parts of the URL so that you actually know what your base point is on the URL, what your endpoints are, and then what the query items are. I realized whenever I was starting to learn how to call information from an API, I had no idea what it was referring to when it said base URL, endpoint, query item. So that's what we're going to do here. There are 3 parts that we really need to pay attention to. Number 1 is your base URL. Your base URL is the part of that URL that stays the same when you make an API request. So what that means here is you can actually see on the documentation what that part is. It's this part that's grayed out because it's going to stay the same. It's always the same. So I'm going to go into this handy dandy text edit here, and we're going to just lay out the parts here. So base URL, and that's going to be that https:/PokeyAPI.co/API/v2. It's the base URL because inside the URL here, you can actually see that it says HTTPS. This part's grayed out. That means if you change anything after this, you'll start getting more information, different information, which good API documentation has exactly what you see here. Now, what is the end? So now what's all this extra stuff at the end here? Well, that extra stuff at the end there, those are your endpoints and possibly your query items. So your first thing is an endpoint. Your endpoint is just another like section in that slash. So if we go back to our text edit here, we can see that's PokeyAPI.co/API-v2, which we know that's the base URL. Let's go ahead and make that blue. Now then our endpoint in this one is your Pokemon. So that's just one endpoint here. So I'm gonna go ahead and type this out. And so that is your endpoint. So that is a endpoint inside this URL. I keep talking about this query item. The query item is what follows the question mark. So here we have question mark limit equals 100. So that's saying, hey, how much information are we getting back? When you're querying, when you're asking the API something and it requires another field that it has to check against, that's a query item. Usually these are like API keys, but here in this case, it's just gonna be at the limit because the Pokey API doesn't require a key. So your query item equals limit. So that is really your query item equals 100, but there's 2 parts to a query item. You have your name and you have your value. So the name is what are you querying on? So in this case, this would be your limit. So query item name. And then you have your query item value. So what are you passing to the API? So query item value equals 100. And your value is generally whatever follows that equal sign there. So I'm gonna go ahead and make the name lime green and make the value orange. And maybe, hopefully this helps you guys. Again, this was just something that I picked up that I realized I didn't know and I had no idea that I should have known what it was. It's great. Learning and having and teaching yourself is awesome. The reason why I wanted you to know the different parts of your URL is because it's going to come in handy when we start creating classes and fetching the actual data. So the next thing we're going to do is actually, start creating a class. We're going to create a Pokey API service class that's going to call that data for us. So like I said, we're going to make this Pokey API service. And how we're going to do this is by creating a new class, and we're going to go ahead and create a new file at the same time too. So inside Xcode, again, right click, new file, another Swift file, Pokey API service, and then we just create a class called the exact same thing. So the first thing we're going to do is create this shared variable, this shared constant that initializes this class right away. That way we can just go and use it straight away. Then the next thing we're going to do is go ahead and create an init. And we have to create that shared because if you notice, our init is private. So by creating that shared, it actually calls it inside of it. Then we're going to go ahead and create a constant for URL sessions. And then for our base URL, remember how we were just talking about dissecting that URL? Well, there, that's the first time that we need it. Boom, I'm going to just Command C, copy that base URL, and we're just going to paste it here. Forgot to declare the constant. All right, so now the next thing we're going to do is create a JSON decoder. So this JSON decoder is going to be what we use to actually decode the JSON into a struct that we're going to make. So it's going to map the values from the JSON into the struct. And that's what we have for the JSON decoder. The JSON decoder would be a lot more useful if we were doing like date conversions or some kind of conversion to go back in between the two, but we don't really have to do that here. So the next thing we need to do is actually declare those endpoints. And this would be a lot more useful if we were going to build on top of this. But we're going to go ahead and do it anyway. That way, if you wanted to go on your own and add in different types of values here, you totally could. We're going to go ahead and use an enum for this, and it's going to have a string as the type and a case iterable as this type. That way we can use it later on. And then also the string so that we can grab that raw value when we need to of Pokemon. So that again, that endpoint is coming from right here. So that we know where in the API we're actually looking for. Now we're going to make another enum, and this one's going to be public, but it's going to be an API service error. So these are pretty much just errors that can happen from calling APIs. These happen all the time whenever you call APIs, response errors, endpoint errors, the API just isn't working, that kind of thing. So now that those API errors have been added, the next thing we're going to do here is we're going to have some fun. I'm going to drink some coffee first. That's actually what we're going to do. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to make a private function that's going to go ahead and create the skeleton of us fetching resources. Again, kind of building on for future. So I like to make things future proof. I wanted to show you guys how to make something if you're planning on adding to it later. And this is the way. So like I said, it's going to be a private function because this one's just going to be used inside this API, inside this class. The next one that we'll make a public function after this that will be used inside the SwiftUI view to actually call the data. All right, so all we did here was we declared a function. It's called fetch resources. We give it a decodable type, the URL. So what URL we're going to fetch on, and then the completion handler that takes in that result, either the result of the type or the result of the Pokey API service error. So success, failure. That's what we got here. So the first thing we need to do is we need to actually check that URL and make sure that it's actually valid. What I did here was I said, hey, can you check these URL components and make sure that they work against that base URL? And if they don't, if for some reason these components are just not valid, we have an invalid endpoint, can't use it. So the next thing we need to do is actually add in that query item. Again, the query item would be more useful as a static thing here if we actually were using a key that was required each time. It's not necessarily required each time, but we're gonna go ahead and put it in. And that query item, to go back to this text edit, that query item, it's that limit equals 100, so the name and the value. So the first thing, query items inside URLs are in arrays of query item because you can chain them together. So the first thing we're going to do is create a whole new query item. And you see there's a name and a value. So the name is limit and that value is 100. If you change that value, instead of getting 100 Pokemon, we'd get 50 if you change it to 50. Now we need to add that query item, those query items to the URL components. So all we did here was we said URL components, your query items are now equal to this one that I just made right up here. Now, the next thing is we want to make sure that this is valid. So let's go ahead and do that same thing with that guard let URL. We're going to check the URL components. And then if that's invalid, we throws another failure. And query items are just another endpoint at the end of the day. So it's a failure of an endpoint. Again, URL components, we just make sure that it's still a URL. And then if not, we throw a failure and we have that invalid endpoint failure there. So now we get to actually do something on whether we call a result, on whether it's a failure or if it's a success. So here we go. We're going to call that URL session.data task with a URL. So that URL that we made up here. So this warning is going to go away. And then we get that result in and we switch on it. And there's only two things here now. And this is using that result from the URL session. So right here, you data with the result. And we either get the success with the result here or the failure. Well, now we get to actually switch on that result type. So case.success. We're gonna get a tuple type that has two things, your response and your data. I'm just gonna print success for now, because the next thing we're gonna do is we're going to go ahead and also take care of the failure case right now. Error. We're just going to print the error. And call the completion handler of .failure .api error. And if you notice, we haven't actually done that for the top. We didn't actually do anything with that yet with our success case, purely because there's a lot more that goes into the success. But the failure, if this doesn't work, we're already just kicking it out right away. Let's go finish this success case now that we handled the failure. So the first thing we need to do is make sure that there's not a status code that we have to handle. Because if there's a status code, then that's bad news bears and there's a failure. We're just going to check for that response and see if there's a status code associated with it. And if it falls between 200 to 299, then we will throw a failure. Or if it doesn't fall between those ranges, that range. So if it falls between 200 to 299, then that's great. Status code is awesome. If it doesn't, then that's when we throw an error. And it's not an invalid endpoint, it's an invalid response at that point, and we return to breakout. Great, so, and I mistyped, notice how there's this error on response. That's because I didn't actually do anything. Because I had a typo. Typos, no bueno, I hate typos. Anyway, so now the next thing we're gonna do is actually be able to call the API. So we're going to get the values, and we get the values by using that Json decoder, and we tried to decode from up here, the T, the type, the data, whatever it is, we try to decode from it. We use T for type, a generic type, just because we don't know what type it is yet. Again, this is really just generics. and we get the data. And then if that is successful, of course, we have to call our success and we send it those values. Now, if it is not successful, this is where we have fun and we say, hey, there was a failure. And this time the failure though is due to that decode error, because if this fails at that point, if try.json decoder fails, then that is a decode error and not anything else. Great. And at that point, we are handling both switch cases. We actually have our success. It's only successful if we get values, which totally makes sense. We don't care if we don't get values. And now we need to actually tell it to resume. So we are going to say .resume so that it can perform this data task, and then it becomes happy again. And that's it. So the next thing we're going to do is actually create a struct, or create two structs, so that we can hold that Pokemon information, so that we can get that name and the URL from the API and actually put it inside our view. And we're going to create a struct for that and make that struct codable. So what we're going to do first off is we're going to go ahead, right click, hit new file. Again, we're not dealing with anything SwiftUI fun here. It's still, it is still dealing with just plain Swift files at this point, nothing too fancy. So how do we determine what gets a struct versus what doesn't get a struct? Well, if you look in here, we made our API call. Now here is the return of that API call. I'm just using Firefox. You can use whatever you want. It's totally fine. I like Firefox. The browser works great. Chrome does something similar where it'll put this JSON just like you see it here. So there's two things in here. So every time you want a struct, when do you want to create a struct? Well, you want to create a struct whenever there's a new JSON object, when there's a new object. So right now, with everything collapsed, we have one object here. It has, and here are the properties of that object: count, next, previous, and results. Now, if you expand results, you actually have an array of another object type that has name and URL, and it just keeps repeating that object. So that tells us we need two structs here. One that has the count, next, previous, and results. And the next one, the other result, and the other JSON object, the other struct, is going to be results, such as has name and URL. So how do we make this? Well, easy. We just go into Xcode here. We are developers after all, and we type some code. And if you're watching this video because you're actually in Xcode right now and you're typing things, you are a developer, whether or not you have the job. Inside this Pokemon models.swift file, we're going to go ahead and create a new struct. So struct, and then we need to give it a name. I'm not going to name it Pokemon. I'm going to name it Pokey results. I'm going to name it Pokemon result, because this is just generic Pokemon result. I would use a struct named Pokemon if we were actually getting the actual Pokemon details. Like for Pikachu, that'd be like the number 25, the name, all that kind of jazz. So we're going to call it Pokemon result. And now we need the fields in here. So give it a variable of a count, and that looks like it's an int based on the value here. Then we have a next, which is a string. Then we have a previous, which if I had to bet, the previous would be a string as well. But notice how it's a null inside here. So it's going to be an optional string. So we don't necessarily need it. And then results, which is going to be an array. We don't know what's going to be. We haven't declared that array type yet, because that array is going to be the second struct that we're going to build. So that's going to be a struct of result, just because it says results. So result. And then what's inside the result? Well, inside the result, we have that name and that URL. So var name, which is a string, and var URL, which is also a string. So now it was expecting an element type. We can go fix that error by giving it a result struct. Now, the other part of these structs is that we have to actually conform to the codable protocol, and that is going to allow us to actually use that JSON decoder. So all we have to do to make that happen is you put the semicolon and codable. It's done. It is now conforming. Oh. All right, so I went to build, and when I built, I got a whole bunch of errors. So the error I made is that this result is it's looking for the struct result and not the struct result that we just made in Pokemon models and not the enum result anymore. So we'll fix this by just putting Pokey result in front of it. And then that should give me, and we fix this call here, and that should fix everything if I hit Command B. Look, there's no more issues. All right, so when you see 20 errors pop up, it's really scary. So I hit Command B. You just want to make sure that you're actually naming unique values. You're not trying to override. So after that private function and fixing that error, those 20 errors, they all went away as soon as I renamed something. It's great. We can now go and make a public function that's going to call the API. So we'll just say fetch Pokey from an endpoint, any given endpoint, result, our good old friend results, and that Pokey API server error, service error. Don't forget to close. And now we get to, I want to make sure I'm not like, so now we get to make that public function that's going to make that call. So public func, we're going to fetch those Pokey results. Fetch Pokey, and we're just gonna say fetch Pokey because, you know, Swift. So now we get to make a public function for this call, so that we can actually fetch the Pokemon. We're gonna call it public func fetch Pokey, and that way, because it's supposed to read like a sentence, Swift is supposed to be very human readable. So by doing fetch Pokey, then we have that from endpoint. So it's going to say fetch Pokey from Pokemon. So it's going to read off very nicely when we get to call it. Which is an endpoint type. And this result here, so what are we going to get back? Well, we're going to get back this struct name. So we're going to get that back, that type of value. And then we also do the Pokey API service error. And it's upset because I hadn't finished. If only Xcode gave me time to finish things. And I forgot a semicolon. Please, Xcode. Maybe if you actually told me the right error, I would fix it. All right. So with that semicolon in place, we got that Pokey result, Pokemon result, Pokey API service. So now we get to actually build that URL. So let URL equals base URL dot appending path component. So we get to add something to it. And we're going to add that endpoint. Make sure you choose the endpoint that has the L, the constant, the variable to it. And that raw, we want to get that raw value. And then we get to fetch the resources. So the URL, that's going to be the URL that we just made. And then the completion is result. So we're going to pass it that result there. And instead of putting a question mark here, because we know it's going to be what it is, we can just do base URL dot appending path component. You can see that there's this error here, and that error is just saying, hey, it's not really going to be, it's not always a URL. So what we can do is, we know this URL is always going to be a URL type. We know that beginning is always URL. So if we specify that exclamation mark there, we get rid of that error down there. All right, now the moment we have all been waiting for. Let's get this information into our SwiftUI view. So let's go into Pokey API. So let's go into the Pokey API tutorial app.swift content view. Let's go there. All right, so what do we need in here? Well, there's a couple of things. A state variable to hold our information, to hold our data. And then we need a list to list that off. So the first thing we're going to do is go ahead and make that state variable. And I like to just give default values here. So we're going to do a Pokey result. We're just going to do, not Pokey result. Pokey, what? Pokemon result. That's what it is. Equals. Pokemon result. Count 0. Next. It really can just be an empty string. These are just placeholders at this point. Nil. And then this can just be an empty array. So now what we need to do is actually build a list. So we're going to replace this text, hello world, with a list. Give it the data of the Pokemon results. So that result array up here. Results. It needs an ID because it doesn't conform to hashable. So we have to give it an ID by itself, which will just have the name. Result in. I just like using result because it's going to be the same. Because it's the same as that result. We are overloading that word result. Then we give it a text in here. That way we can show something. Result.name. So now that we have the list written, we still haven't really called the API. So the next thing we need to do is actually call that API. And we're going to do that in onAppear. So when this view loads, it's just going to automatically call for us. So now all we have to do is call that service class that we have, that Pokey API service. We can call that shared so it initiates itself. Fetch Pokemon from where? Well, we just want the Pokemon. And then what are we going to do with the results? Well, we are going to get that result. Pokemon result. There we go. I'm going to go ahead and close it, but I shouldn't have closed it yet because we need one more thing. Pokey API service. Pokey API service dot error. Oops, service error. That's why it's upset, because it's only one value result. And now we can actually switch here. Switch on result. Case.success. Let results. And this is where we get to actually say those results, which are going to be those values in the end, get added to that struct. So they're going to get added to the struct up here. So we just say Pokemon equals results. And then now we need to handle that failure. Remember, always handle your failure. And all we'll do is print the error. All right, and that's it. That's all we had to do. It'll catch up when I hit build. Now, let's go ahead and run this and see it go. And there we go. It has loaded. It is nice. It is all in there. Here we are. Here are all 100 of those Pokemon. Isn't that fun? Anyway, if you enjoyed this video, as I'm sure you have, you enjoyed me watching you, guiding you around Xcode to make this small little Pokey API caller and this little tutorial on how to do this, please drop a follow, hit the like, share with all your friends, share with everyone. I'd be super happy. Make sure, like I said, to hit the subscribe button though, so that you can catch more Swift tool tips, tricks, more code, coffee, tech later. And I'll catch y'all next time. Bye.